Ahoy, and welcome. This is Admiral. It's been a while since AoE2 got a new medieval architecture set. And by a while, I mean we're coming up on 6 years this November since the Central Asian set became the most recent edition with the release of Definitive Edition. In fact, the general scarcity of new assets for several years has had me wondering if we'd ever see a second set in the DE era, with most DLCs providing the obligatory wonder, castle, unique unit, and hero graphics for new civilizations, but little else, and with no indication of accommodating the more optimistic fan requests until very recently. Of course, Battle for Greece added not one, but two full antiquity architecture sets and a jaw-dropping quantity of other assets for its three factions, which were fantastic additions within their sphere, and built a strong foundation for an immersive game mode set in antiquity. But for all their ancient glory, these weren't the medieval masterpieces some of us were waiting for, and didn't do much for the aesthetic of standard civilizations, although they did provide value for modders and scenario designers. Most recently, we had the outstanding April patch, which has been the most significant graphical update for the base game since the release of Definitive Edition. While it didn't include any full architecture sets, it managed to check off several major and long-awaited fan requests at once, including unique castles, elite skins for unique units, and regional monks and monasteries. It's hard to overstate how much of a game changer this was for creators, modders, and players in general, and it's one of those things that makes me optimistic about the development of AoE2, in spite of several creative decisions of late. In any case, the new graphics are much appreciated and hopefully a sign of things to come, and it's natural to think about what might be the next steps for graphical upgrades. We've already covered some important possibilities on this channel, namely regional unit skins and more differentiated architecture sets for East Asian and Black Sea civilizations, all of which would be high-value additions. The next architecture set I want to consider is a nomadic set, or more specifically, an Asiatic nomad or steppe set, as of course nomadism existed in other parts of the world, but most of the recipients of such a set in AoE2 would be Asian civilizations. Other possible names for it might be a pastoral or migration set, as nomadic is an evocative but flawed term when it comes to many of the buildings in question, and indeed all of them from a technical perspective unless you were to actually add nomadic mechanics, which will be a future discussion. But for now we'll stick with nomadic as the most common designation for such a building set. This would be relevant to four existing civilizations: the Mongols, Cumans, Khitans, and Huns. It could also be used for future early Turkic civilizations, or partially used for other future civilizations with significant nomadic origins or elements, possibly including Tanguts and Tibetans. Of note are several fan concepts and mods made over the years to represent this type of architecture. I definitely have my critiques of these concepts, namely the overuse of tents even for larger buildings, and the patchwork quilt or gaudy circus pavilion styles, but I don't expect perfection from fan-made projects from the HD era, and these are at least decent starting points for envisioning the general feel of nomadic architecture, and I do appreciate the creativity. Here's a more recent concept that has a lot to like, although the red color is a little too loud and concentrated, and some buildings like the university look a little too fortified. But it's otherwise a great amateur concept that captures the basics of what I think a good nomadic set could look like, and it's not hard to imagine an official version somewhat inspired by this. I also think it would be the easiest architectural set to add for a couple reasons. First off, we already have a solid head start when it comes to nomadic assets, including shrines and the yurts in the scenario editor, which could become house reskins with minimal effort. If pastures are ever balanced to become more generic to where they could be given to other civilizations, they would become yet another distinctive and immersive nomadic marker. Taking the Mongols as an example, just adding the existing yurt and pasture skins to them would go a long way to making them look and feel more appropriately unique. And we've already talked about reskinning the mill to something like a smokehouse or food storehouse for pastoral civilizations. Secondly, and on a related note, nomadism is typically partial and transitional in the course of civilization. Even the Dark Age house and town center skins shared by all civilizations are basically glorified tents before the material upgrades of later ages. But certain mid to late game buildings such as the university, monastery, and of course castle and other advanced fortifications represent the importance of static sites for learning, worship, and defense, even among formerly or seasonally restless peoples, and are mostly exclusive with pure nomadism, or at least with mobile design. Even docks don't make much sense as nomadic structures, as they would typically be permanent anchor points for ships, sheltered in favorable harbors and easily discoverable by proximity to prominent landmarks. As such, I don't think that a nomadic set would have to cover all buildings in the way that a standard architecture set does. And returning to the example of the Mongols, an early and mid-game with iconic nomadic features such as yurts, pastures, and specific nomadic blacksmiths and early military buildings may be sufficient. Their late-game buildings could appropriately be represented by the more permanent architecture from a new mainland East Asian set we've covered in another video, in reference to the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Not that I would mind semi- or post-nomadic interpretations of the university, dock, or keep, and the new graphic for the Hunnic castle exemplifies much of the design aesthetic that I'd like to see for such concepts. It's obviously not mobile, but is more austere than most castles, relying heavily on unadorned wood and thatch atop a very generic stone base, and appropriately symbolizing the very limited architectural aspirations of the Huns at large. It also accurately reflects that the historical Huns greatly predate modern building codes, as there's no way that this mother of all fire hazards would ever get approved today, much less as a recruitment center for horsemen carrying lit torches at all times. Although apart from castles and shrines, I think late-game nomadic buildings should feature rammed earth or wattle and daub more frequently than stone masonry, and of course wood, canvas, and hide in some cases, and should generally look a little more crude and more hastily assembled than most other late-game architecture. Again though, this so-called late-game component of a new nomadic set is optional, and could just be substituted for the permanent structures of the next closest building set. So if there was ever a set that could be added piecemeal like the monastery reskins, it would be the nomadic set. It's not always clear where the cutoff should be, and some of these civilizations exist within a sort of historical and architectural nomad's land that could best be accommodated by a hybrid building set. There could even be variations in nomadic intensity across different civilizations, with Tibetans and Tanguts perhaps merely dabbling in pastoralism,
I haven't even mentioned all the free yak smell.
Cumans somewhere in the middle, and Huns going full nomad. In summary, and before we migrate away from this topic, I think at least a partial nomadic set has a ton of potential. And of course, I would not complain if they made a full set. If nothing else, there's some low-hanging fruit in just giving yurts to Cumans, Mongols, and Khitans, and especially the last two instead of their Japanese-style houses. So those are my thoughts, but how far would you want nomadic or migratory architecture to be taken, and what do you think about the concept generally? Let me know in the comments. That's all for today, and thanks for watching. This has been me pitching a plan for perceptibly packable or passably pastoral places, be they partial or prolific. Till next time.